The first thing they smelled was smoke, but not the kind they had come to fear. It wasn't scorched brick or burning fuel. It was warm, earthy, rich, and it made their stomachs clench in disbelief. The women stepped off the bus into the dusty light of a Texas afternoon, their wool uniforms hanging limp against the heat, eyes darting across the strange landscape. This was supposed to be a prison. They had braced for cages, for mockery, for punishment. Instead, the breeze carried the unmistakable scent of hickory and mesquite. One woman froze mid-step. Another whispered, "Is that meat?" A young guard chuckled quietly and pointed to the source. A group of American ranchers standing beside an open-flame grill, skewers sizzling, smoke curling toward the sky. "Welcome to camp," one said, tipping his hat. She blinked, stunned. Bacon in captivity was one thing, but barbecue? That was beyond comprehension, and it was only the beginning. The smell of barbecue still clung faintly to the morning air, but the landscape in front of them seemed like something out of a painting, too still, too clean, too vast to be real. They stepped off the military bus one by one, boots crunching against the red dirt as the Texas sun dropped like a weight across their shoulders. For a moment, the women stood in silence. Not because they had been ordered to, but because none of them knew what to make of the place. Behind them, barbed wire fences shimmered in the heat, curving around an orderly camp that looked more like a ranch than a prison. Ahead, a row of low wooden buildings sat beneath towering oaks, their porches swept clean, American flags barely stirring in the breeze. A guard leaned against a post nearby, not barking orders, but sipping from a chipped enamel mug. His rifle rested beside him, slung casually like a tool of habit, not threat. He gave a short nod as they passed. Some women didn't know whether to return the gesture or keep their eyes down. One did both at once. They had been marched across Europe by shouting men, herded into boxcars by those who treated them as property of the state. But here, in this strange corner of Texas, there were no dogs, no sirens, no lines of shouting, just the hum of cicadas and the smell of livestock on the breeze. One of the women, a nurse from Dresden, her hair tucked under a fraying cap, tightened her grip on the small satchel she had carried from the camp in France. She had packed it herself under duress, thinking she would never see it again. Now it hung heavy on her shoulder, still with her, as though the past hadn't quite let go. Her eyes scanned the open field beyond the wire. A line of cows grazed in the distance, swishing their tails beneath the same sky that had once poured fire on her city. Nearby, another prisoner murmured, "This can't be real." The group was led to a shaded registration building where instead of being shoved or shouted at, they were asked, quietly, to state their names. The Americans recorded each one with a stamp and a pencil, not a slap. The process was quick, impersonal, almost clinical. It felt like they were being processed by clerks, not conquerors. One woman, a former radio operator, whispered to the woman behind her, "Why aren't they angry?" Inside the barracks, they found cots lined in neat rows, mattresses already laid out, sheets folded at the end. The floors were swept, windows opened to let in the breeze. A pitcher of cold water waited on a nearby table. One by one they drank, hesitant at first, then greedily. The ice stung their teeth. It was the first time in months, perhaps years, that water had been more than just warm and rationed. Someone laughed through her nose and shook her head. "The enemy makes better hosts than our own officers ever did." Later, walking through the edge of the camp under supervision, the women caught glimpses of abundance they hadn't seen since before the war. Rows of tall corn shimmering in the breeze, a warehouse with crates of canned peaches, and on the far edge of the fence, a smoking pit where ranchers were turning cuts of meat over a fire. The scent drifted again, sweet and savory, and without thinking, one of the women inhaled deeply, her eyes fluttering shut. No one had told them this part. No one prepared them for this kind of contradiction. They had braced for hunger, for filth, for the stripping of every last scrap of pride. Instead, they were offered clean water, clean beds, and the scent of slow-cooked meat on the wind. It didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like confusion made real. And in that confusion, a question began to form, soft, dangerous, and impossible to answer. What if everything they'd been told about the enemy was wrong? She didn't have time to answer the question before another one rose up, sharper, more immediate, and impossible to ignore. What is that smell? It hit them as they crossed the yard in single file. Not the sour, institutional stench of boiled cabbage or powdered eggs like in the camps back east. This was thick and sweet, almost smoky. The women's steps faltered. It floated on the air like something half-remembered, pulled from a time before air raids and train cars, before bunkers and ration cards. It smelled like Sunday, like home. One woman gasped out loud, then covered her mouth as though the sound itself might get her punished. Another muttered a single word, half in awe, half in disbelief. Fleisch. They were marched toward the mess hall, but the scent was coming from the opposite direction, from an open grill near the edge of the yard, where two men in cowboy hats stood flipping something over a fire pit. The smoke curled lazily, carrying with it the unmistakable aroma of barbecued meat, mesquite wood, beef fat, salt. It wasn't just food. It was memory. It was the kind of smell you could taste with your eyes closed, the kind that dragged you back to a kitchen where your mother still hummed while slicing onions. It was unbearable. The women were handed trays inside the mess hall, each holding a scoop of beans, cornbread, and, to their astonishment, a chunk of grilled beef, blackened at the edges, pink in the center. A few hesitated, their hands trembling. One woman clutched the tray as if waiting for the catch, some twist, some cruelty to follow. Another looked down at the food and then up at the American cook, who simply nodded once and moved on. No smirk, no superiority. Just a man doing a job. They sat at long wooden tables, unsure whether to eat or brace. The nurse from Dresden took a bite first, almost without meaning to. Her teeth sunk into the meat, and her jaw clenched around the sudden wave of taste. Fat, salt, smoke. Her throat tightened, not in hunger, but in grief. The food wasn't just food, it was proof. Proof that they were being fed like people, not cattle, not traitors, not monsters. Around her the reactions varied. Some ate slowly, mechanically, their faces blank. Others chewed like they hadn't in weeks, eyes wide, hands shaking. One woman closed her eyes, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as she held a piece of cornbread against her lips. Another burst into laughter, loud and sudden, startling even herself. She clapped a hand over her mouth and looked around in horror. But no punishment came. The guards didn't react. In fact, one of them, young, sunburned, leaning casually near the door, grinned slightly, almost as if he understood. The room fell into a strange hush, broken only by the clink of cutlery and the low hum of guarded conversation. A woman near the end of the table muttered something in German. "They're mocking us." Another shook her head. "No, they're just feeding us." The two stared at each other, and neither could say which was more terrifying, The guards, for their part, behaved nothing like the caricatures they had imagined. No shouting, no jeers, just quiet glances and the occasional soft word. One walked by, sipping coffee, nodding politely to a woman who had dropped her fork. He stooped to pick it up, placed it back on her tray, and walked on. She stared after him, stunned. If he had slapped her, it might have made more sense. Outside the hall, the wind shifted, the smoke returned. The smell of meat, of firewood, of something warm and human, curled around the barracks like an accusation. It wasn't cruelty that undid them. It was this, the unbearable fact that kindness, mundane, practical, routine, was far more disorienting than hate. And some women refused to be disoriented. They clung to hunger like it was a shield. In the days after the barbecue meal, trays still arrived, still warm, still heavy with food. But not every woman touched them. One sat motionless through every meal, her tray untouched, her lips pressed into a thin line. Another picked at her beans, moving them around the plate like soldiers on a battlefield, but never once raised her fork. One woman even tore her meat into strips and, when the guards weren't looking, slipped them into the lining of her pillow. "If they stop feeding us," she whispered, "I'll have something left." It wasn't defiance in the old sense, not the loud, flag-waving kind. It was quieter, more intimate. For many of these women, starving was easier than reconciling with the fact that the enemy had just fed them like family. They had been told surrender meant degradation. But this was worse. Dignity served hot. Inside their heads, the war had not ended. One woman from Bremen, thin and hollow-eyed, said nothing during meals, but her journal told the story. "Why should I eat when my mother boils weeds for supper? Her guilt fed her more than any meat could. Her belly ached, but her conscience ached more. To accept a warm plate from American hands felt like betrayal, of country, of family, of every death that had come before." Others wrestled silently. Some took the food but wrapped it in napkins, hiding it in their cots as if expecting a trick. A few choked back tears while chewing, each bite tasting of salt and memory. Even nourishment became political. One woman, when given a soft biscuit, stared at it for a long time and muttered, "I have not had bread this white since childhood." She bit into it, eyes wet, and turned away from the others. There was no victory in this, only loss of certainty, of control, of the righteous narrative that had carried them across a continent now buried under rubble. And yet, in the midst of the tension, came an unexpected sound. Laughter. It happened one afternoon when the mess hall served brisket, coated in a thick reddish-brown glaze. One of the younger women, a secretary who had once taken shorthand in Berlin, dipped a cautious finger into the sauce, sniffed it, and then, suspicious, licked it quickly. Her face twisted with shock. She gagged dramatically and spat it onto the floor. "It's poison!" she shouted, half panicked, half incredulous. The others froze, but before fear could rise, the cook behind the counter, a heavy-set man with a red bandana, threw up his hands and laughed. "That's just barbecue sauce, darlin'," he said in slow Southern English. His tone was more amused than offended. The absurdity cracked the tension like glass. Someone snorted, someone else giggled. Even the woman who spat began to laugh, covering her mouth in disbelief. That brief burst of humor was disarming in a different way. It reminded them of something deeply inconvenient, that these men, these guards, these supposed enemies, had jokes, and accents, and names, and appetites. The enemy was not faceless anymore. It was complicated, and that, more than any weapon, threatened to collapse everything they'd held on to. As the scent of barbecue still lingers in the air, we want to ask you, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We read everyone. And if this story moves you, or if it challenges what you thought you knew about WW2, take a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel. You'll find the subscribe button just below the video. Tap it, and don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss the next powerful story we share. Your support helps us keep bringing these untold histories to light. Back in the barracks that night, one of the women who had refused to eat finally brought a piece of bread to her mouth. She didn't chew it, just held it there, lips trembling. The hunger was real, but so was the doubt, and both of them had started to whisper the same thing. What if kindness isn't the enemy? It was a question they could never have imagined asking back in Germany, where the war had ended not with a bang, but with a slow, shuddering unraveling. In those final weeks, no one talked of kindness. There was only collapse. By the time the Americans arrived, most of the women were already halfway ghosts. Tired uniforms hanging off skeletal frames, skin raw from weeks without soap, eyes that no longer blinked at the sound of explosions. They had lived through a winter where the sky was never silent and the ground never warm. Propaganda leaflets had warned of what was coming: American cruelty, American vengeance, American filth. Posters on crumbling walls showed grinning soldiers with knives for teeth and blood on their hands. Radios whispered that if women were captured, they'd be paraded naked through the streets, used and discarded, humiliated until death was a mercy. Some believed it, some didn't, but all feared it. The training sessions in the final months of the Reich made it clear. Capture was not survival. It was defeat in its most personal form. One woman remembered her instructor, a red-faced sergeant missing 2 fingers, screaming, "Better to bite your tongue off than let a Yankee put his hands on you." Another recalled being told that surrender was a betrayal of the fatherland, of her family, of history itself. "If they take you," a superior had said once, his voice shaking from drink, "they'll destroy you from the inside out." They had believed him. What else was there to believe when your city was ash and your rations had turned to bark? The collapse came not all at once, but in a slow, agonizing drift. Cities fell like dominoes. Communications broke down. Rumors raced ahead of news: Allied troops in the west, the Russians in the east. One by one, women were ordered to abandon posts, to burn files, to blend into the civilian population if they could. Some tried. Others were swept up in the chaos and shoved onto convoys headed nowhere. They were secretaries, radio operators, messengers, nurses, soldiers in name but civilians at heart, caught in the machinery of a crumbling empire. For many, the last sight of their hometowns was from the back of a truck. Houses gutted, smoke still curling from roofs, children digging through ruins for crusts. One woman clutched a photograph of her brother, taken before he vanished on the Eastern Front. Another carried a bar of soap wrapped in cloth, a gift from a mother she might never see again. They boarded trains in silence, ordered west toward an unknown fate. The guards said nothing. The whistles blew. And then the countryside began to move past their windows like a funeral procession. Inside the boxcars they huddled together for warmth. There was no food, no latrines, no explanation. They passed the time counting bruises, tracing the names of cities onto the walls with broken fingernails: Hamburg, Berlin, Leipzig, trying to remember the order in which they had died. One woman whispered, "Maybe they'll kill us quickly." No one disagreed. But then the train began to slow. The landscape outside changed. Green fields, not gray ruins, wooden fences, a clear blue sky, the sound of birds, And then, just before the doors opened, the smell of bacon. It drifted through the cracks in the wood like an insult, like a memory they didn't trust. It wasn't supposed to smell like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. They had braced for blood, for fire, for the fulfillment of every terrible warning etched into their skulls. Instead, they stepped down into silence, into sun, into the slow, terrifying realization that everything they had feared was now turning into something far more dangerous. Doubt. Doubt in the stories they were raised on. Doubt in the men who sent them here. Doubt in a war that had demanded their loyalty, but never explained the price. That doubt deepened with each passing day inside the Texas ranch camp, where nothing resembled the prisons they'd prepared for. Instead of cages, there were barracks, long wooden buildings raised off the dry ground, with windows that opened and beds made of real wood frames and canvas mattresses. Thin, yes, but soft. So soft that the first time a woman lay down, she sat up again in a panic, convinced it must be a mistake. Each morning began with a bell, not a bark. The women filed into the mess hall, where breakfast was always waiting: eggs, toast, hot coffee, sometimes even fruit. They no longer jumped when their names were called for mail. Letters were allowed, so long as they passed through censors, and the first time one woman held a note from her sister back in Frankfurt, she wept openly, clutching it like a relic. Another folded hers neatly, slid it into her pocket, and read it only when the lights were out and the room was quiet. Days settled into patterns, though the unease never quite left. They cleaned their own barracks, tended to vegetable plots, and helped in the kitchens or laundry. Work was assigned in rotating shifts, but never forced. Refusing brought no beatings, only fewer privileges, fewer tokens, small slips of camp currency that could be exchanged at the canteen for cigarettes, thread, chocolate. One woman saved hers for 2 weeks to buy a tin of apricots, which she opened in secret and ate with her fingers, weeping silently as syrup ran down her wrists. It wasn't the sweetness that made her cry. It was the strangeness of having something just for herself. The guards were everywhere and nowhere, present but rarely threatening. Most wore wide-brimmed hats, their boots dusty, their sleeves rolled up against the heat. They carried rifles, yes, but often rested them lazily against the porch railings. They didn't march, they leaned. They joked with each other in that slow, twangy English the women had come to recognize as Texan. One guard, older than the others, was nicknamed the Farmer by the women. He handed out sun hats on hot days, and sometimes brought extra peaches to the mess hall. Another guard was seen helping a prisoner fix her boot, crouched on one knee like a shoemaker. These moments didn't erase the fear, but they made it harder to hold on to the hate. Then came the music. It began one afternoon when a radio was turned on in the mess hall during cleanup. The sound was sharp and unfamiliar, guitars strumming, a fiddle whining, a man singing in a drawl about trains and rivers and going home. The women froze, confused. This wasn't the triumphant brass of German marches. This was something looser, sadder, stranger. Some laughed. One clapped along, off-beat, until another shushed her. But the music returned the next day, and the next, always around the same time. Eventually it faded into the rhythm of things, like the sound of boots or bird song. A few women hummed the tunes under their breath, unaware they were doing it. Meals became less tense. Laughter returned in pockets, quiet, restrained, but real. Someone made a joke about how the Americans salted everything, even watermelon. Someone else tried to imitate a guard's accent and was so accurate that the entire table cracked up, including the guard standing nearby, who gave a mock salute and walked on. It wasn't freedom. They were still prisoners. The wire still curled along the camp's edge, glinting under the sun. But inside the fences, the world was not what it had been. It wasn't victory. It wasn't punishment. It was something else entirely, something they didn't yet have a name for. But it felt, for the first time in a long time, like the beginning of safety. That night, safety became its own kind of enemy. When the lights dimmed and the camp settled into stillness, an unease crept through the barracks that no one wanted to name. The sound was what struck them first, or rather, the absence of it. No air raid sirens, no rumbling artillery, no boots pounding on stairs or glass shattering in the distance, only the dry whisper of wind across the plains, and somewhere, faintly, the chirring of crickets. For women who had survived years of thunder and fire, the silence was unbearable. It pressed down on their chests like weight, thick and strange. One woman turned in her bunk, clutching her blanket tight around her shoulders. Another sat up, unable to rest, scanning the dark for threats that no longer existed. Peace, it turned out, had its own kind of terror. The blankets were too soft, the air too calm, the stars too bright. A nurse from Hamburg whispered to no one in particular, "It's too quiet. Something's coming." But nothing did. The guards paced their rounds, boots scuffing softly in the dirt, and the women lay awake, each trapped inside her own mind, waiting for a bomb that never fell. For years they had trained their bodies to flinch at noise. Now they had to learn how to live without it. Some whispered prayers. Others replayed memories of nights spent in basements with strangers, clutching children that weren't theirs, counting explosions as if the numbers might protect them. Here, there was nothing to count. One woman couldn't take it. She climbed out of bed, trembling, and began to fold and unfold her blanket again and again until her hands stopped shaking. She whispered that it was too clean, too warm, too good. She cried quietly into it, the softness itself undoing her. That small act, a tear shed not from pain, but from comfort, rippled through the room. The others didn't move, but they heard it. They all did. And in that soundless space, every one of them felt the same thing. The war might be over outside, but inside it was still raging. Days passed, and the strangeness of calm began to settle. With the quiet came words. The women were given paper and pencils, and for the first time since capture, allowed to write home. The letters had to pass through censors, but still, it was a connection to a world that had been nothing but smoke and memory. They wrote carefully, unsure what could be said. One woman's letter read simply, "We are safe, we are fed, they treat us like people." Another wrote that she had seen cows grazing freely, that she'd tasted fruit again, that she'd slept through the night without dreaming of rubble. But she also wrote, in smaller letters at the bottom, "I do not know how to feel about it." When the replies came weeks later, they were full of hunger. One described children boiling nettles for soup. Another mentioned a mother dying of cold in a basement. A third was a blank sheet, returned with a stamp. Address unknown. The weight of those letters broke something open. The camp, with its warm meals and quiet nights, became unbearable to some. Guilt spread like fever. One woman pushed her plate away at breakfast, muttering, "My sister is starving." Another, who had grown rounder since arriving, refused to step on the scale at medical inspection, ashamed of her own weight gain. The guards didn't understand. They thought the women were ungrateful. But it wasn't ingratitude, it was grief, a grief made worse by the comfort that surrounded it. That night, the nurse from Hamburg lay awake again, listening to the crickets. She stared at the ceiling, tracing patterns in the wood, trying to make sense of it all. Safety, she thought, wasn't the end of war. It was a different kind of battle, One fought in silence, with memory as the enemy, and as she finally closed her eyes, she wondered whether peace would ever feel peaceful again. The next morning, that question took on new weight. Just after breakfast, one of the guards, boots dusty, hat tipped low, stepped into the barracks with a clipboard and a strange offer. "You ladies up for working outside the fence today?" he asked, like it was a casual thing. No rifles pointed, no shouting, just a drawl and a nod toward the gates. A few women blinked at him, unsure if it was a joke or a trap, but he only shrugged and added, "Ranch needs fixing. Could use the help." A dozen women volunteered, curiosity outweighed suspicion, and soon they were walking past the wire, beyond the perimeter they'd spent weeks memorizing. The sky opened wide as a sea. Dust rose with each step, and then came the work. Mending broken fences, stacking bales of hay, patching troughs. It was hard, dry labor under the Texas sun. Blisters formed quick. Sweat ran down spines, and more than one woman cursed under her breath in German. But it was real work, honest work. For some, that made it bearable. For others, it made it harder, because it didn't make sense. By midday, they were aching, red-faced, and stunned to find themselves laughing. One cowboy, spotting a prisoner struggling with barbed wire, gave her a leather glove and said, "Ain't no shame in learnin'. Took me years to not bleed." She looked at him like he'd spoken a magic spell. Not because of the words, but because of the tone. There was no menace, just a man offering help. Lunch came in metal tins and tinier jokes. Coffee was passed around, thick, bitter stuff poured from a blackened pot slung over the fire. One woman nearly spit it out. Another, braver, asked for seconds. The cowboys talked in circles, horses, rain. A neighbor's stubborn bull. The women, at first stiff, began to offer their own stories. A bakery back in Bremen, a lost violin, a brother who hated cabbage. Laughter slipped out. It sounded strange in the heat, like something that didn't belong. And then, during a lull, one of the older ranchers leaned back on a fence post and asked gently, "Do you miss home?" It was a simple question, but it cracked something open. The youngest woman looked down at her boots and nodded once, quickly. Another stared straight ahead and said nothing. A third, after a long silence, answered, "Yes, but I do not know what is left of it." No one laughed. No one changed the subject. The cowboy just took a sip of his coffee, nodded slowly, and said, "War takes a lot." That conversation spread later, like embers carried by wind. Back in the barracks, the women didn't talk about fences or cows. They talked about the men, not as enemies, as oddities. Why didn't they hate us? Why didn't they mock us? A few women speculated it was all a trick, a way to soften them before something worse. But others, quieter, didn't speak at all. They were too busy replaying the looks, the shared sunburns, the offer of a glove. One woman wrote in her journal that night, "I expected chains. Instead, I held a hammer. I expected curses. Instead, I was asked if I missed my mother." That day outside the fence did not make them free, but it made them human again. It gave them something they hadn't had in years, a moment without orders, a breath without suspicion, a meal shared without a motive. And for many, that was more dangerous than barbed wire ever could be. It began with a blackboard. One morning, without ceremony, a section of the recreation hall was cleared and fitted with rows of benches and a dusty chalkboard nailed to the wall. The guards called it the classroom, though no one quite knew who requested it. Maybe it came from the Red Cross. Maybe it was the idea of the camp commander. But there it was, letters written in block print, waiting to be read aloud. Apple, book, freedom. At first, most of the women ignored it. It felt absurd. Why learn the language of your captors? Why practice saying please and thank you in a tongue that had filled Allied broadcasts and leaflets for years? But then came boredom. Then came curiosity. And finally came a woman named Ilsa, sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed, who said, "If we're going to survive here, we might as well understand what they're saying." So they sat, and they listened. The lessons were simple: greetings, nouns, little sentences. "My name is... I am from... I like coffee." The guards took turns helping. Not all were patient teachers, but they smiled when the women tried. One even brought flashcards, pictures of trees, animals, and barbecue. That one got laughs. Barbecue was easier to say than ideology. Soon books appeared, old ones with yellowing pages and scribbled notes in the margins. One woman was handed a battered copy of Tom Sawyer. She opened it, skeptical, but by the second chapter she was hooked. She read under her blanket with a flashlight smuggled from the tool shed. Another discovered American music, tinny songs from a portable record player. It crackled through the barracks, big band swing, crooners in tuxedos, ballads about lost love. For some the sounds were alien, for others hypnotic. Then came the harmonica. One of the older guards, tall, grizzled, sunburnt, played in the evenings, sometimes just outside the mess hall. He didn't speak much, but he played. Songs that didn't need translation. Some slow, some joyful. The first time he played Red River Valley, a woman stood frozen near the door, mouth open. "It sounds like something my grandfather would have sung," she whispered. From then on, a few of them lingered after dinner, just to listen. And yet, under all of it, something tugged. One afternoon, after a grammar lesson, a woman named Renate stayed behind. She had struggled that day, mixing freedom with family, tripping over the word home. The young guard who taught the class asked if she was okay. She looked at him for a long time before asking softly, "Do you really believe we're all the same?" He didn't answer right away, just looked down at his boots. Then he nodded once, barely. She didn't speak again. But something shifted. That night, Renate sat on her bunk, turning over the flashcards. One had a picture of a mother and child. The word underneath said, "Love." Another showed two people shaking hands. "Friend." She stared at it longer than she meant to. And then came the realization. Not with fireworks, but with quiet dread. She didn't hate them anymore. It unsettled her more than any punishment ever had. Because if these men were not monsters, then what had the war really been? If the enemy could teach her to say thank you with a smile, then what else had been a lie? Learning English didn't mean surrender. But it opened a door, and once opened, it could not be closed. The language of her captors had become the language of questioning, and for the first time, the war no longer felt like a story told from only one side. The first letters arrived weeks later, carried in a burlap sack slung over a soldier's shoulder. It was a clear morning, sunlight washing over the camp like a cruel kind of grace. The women gathered near the gates as names were called out, one by one, like a roll call of ghosts returning to life. Some letters were written in shaky ink on scraps of paper. Others were no more than postcards, torn and smudged, barely legible. Each envelope was a piece of a world they had left behind, and what they found inside would change everything. Ilsa's letter came first. It was short, only a few lines. "The bakery is gone, so is the church. The river froze again. We still dig for coal in the garden to stay warm." Her mother's signature trembled at the bottom, a line of ink that looked like it might break under its own weight. Ilse read it 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it into her blouse. Then she asked for water, and when they brought her a cup, she poured it into the dirt. For another woman, Hilda, the news was worse. Her brother, last heard from in Stettin, was gone. "Missing," the letter said, which in those days meant never found. Her father had died of pneumonia, her mother of starvation. The street where they had lived was nothing but rubble now. There was a new bakery run by strangers. The letter ended with one sentence: "If you are alive, stay wherever you are. It is better there." That night, Hilda stopped eating. No one said anything. Meals came and went, plates were cleared, and her portion sat untouched. The smell of meat, once unbearable, then comforting, now turned her stomach. When a guard offered her cornbread, she shook her head. "My mother hasn't eaten in weeks," she said softly. "Why should I?" Others began to break in quieter ways. One woman tore her uniform into strips and burned it behind the barracks, the fabric curling and blackening as if it were trying to vanish. Another wept over a postcard showing a smiling soldier in front of a tank, her husband, long dead, frozen in a moment of propaganda that now felt obscene. The camp, once a place of strange safety, became unbearable under the weight of those letters. The women could no longer unsee the contrast. Here they were fed, sheltered, even taught. Outside, their people were starving in the ruins. Each meal became a moral test. One day, after lunch, a guard carried out a bin of scraps, half-eaten barbecue, bones, bread crusts, and dumped it near the fence for burning. One of the women saw it happen and froze. She stepped forward slowly, tears running down her face, and whispered, "Don't." The guard frowned, not understanding. She pointed to the meat, her voice rising. "Children are dying for this." No one answered her. The guard only hesitated, his hand still on the bin, then turned and walked away. The smell of smoke from the waste pit drifted across the yard like an accusation. That evening, the women sat in silence on their bunks. Someone asked the question they were all thinking. Why did they feed us while our own people starved? It was not a question of gratitude. It was a wound. No one knew the answer, and no one dared to guess. The next morning, when the bell rang for breakfast, a few women refused to rise. Others stood, out of habit, out of obedience. Out of hunger, they could no longer separate from shame. The food tasted the same, but it no longer filled them. It only deepened the hollow. For the first time, captivity felt heavier than chains. It felt like guilt itself had found a place at the table. Then, one morning, everything shifted. The war was over, officially, finally, and with a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. Papers were signed, flags changed. The guards, still in boots and hats, still with the same slow Texas drawl, read out the announcement with the solemnity of a funeral. The gates would open in a week. The trains were coming. The women were going home. But what did home mean now? Inside the camp, there were no cheers, no celebrations, just a quiet flurry of packing, folding, and staring. One woman carried her things in a canvas sack, a blanket, a pair of socks, and a New Testament with her name written in pencil on the inside cover. Another had nothing but the letters she'd received, creased and worn, each one read so many times the ink had bled into the paper. A third, Marta, packed her things with trembling hands, then looked around her bunk and hesitated. She reached under the mattress, pulled out a sun-bleached cowboy hat a guard had jokingly given her, and after a long moment placed it gently on top of her belongings. At the train station, the farewells were strange. There were no official salutes, no American anthems, just nods, murmured goodbyes, a few attempts at English that didn't quite land. One of the guards handed out small paper bags with food, bread, apples, and a few strips of dried meat. Some women wept. Some stared forward. Some whispered to each other about what it would be like to walk into cities that no longer existed. One woman turned back before boarding the train. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at the camp's water tower in the distance, as if trying to remember every detail of the place she'd once feared and had come to understand only too late. The train clattered eastward, through Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Tennessee, then up toward the eastern ports. They passed fields, towns, factories, and finally the coast. Each kilometer carried them further from Texas, and yet none of them felt farther from home than when they had first arrived in America. On the final night before embarkation, someone lit a small fire near the docks. Just driftwood and scraps, but the smoke curled into the sky, warm and rich. It smelled, impossibly, like mesquite. One of the women inhaled sharply. Another covered her face, but Marta stood still. For her, that first scent of barbecue back in Texas had marked a beginning, of confusion, of questioning, of betrayal and tenderness all tangled together. She remembered the bite, tender meat, unfamiliar spices, and how it had melted in her mouth while every belief she'd been taught was collapsing. It hadn't just been food, it had been a rupture. Now, the same scent rose again, and with it came everything. The shame of eating while others starved, the safety of cotton sheets, the laughter at lunch, the cowboy who asked if she missed her home, and the quiet of a Texas night broken only by crickets. Some memories don't fade. They sear. When the ship left port, carrying the women back to a continent shattered beyond recognition, Marta kept her paper bag of dried meat. Not to eat, but to hold. The scent reminded her of something she couldn't explain, something real. Not propaganda, not survival, but change. Years later, when asked about her time as a prisoner, she didn't mention the fences or the guards. She didn't talk about the letters or the classes or even the war. She only said this: "I stopped believing the day I tasted smoke and it didn't kill me."